one of the best investors of all time, and certainly the best investor in public financial services stock. And maybe, Bill, you could talk a little bit about your own way that you came to Bitcoin, and maybe talk a little bit about network effects.
Sure. Well, first, I caught Tim earlier. He had his Bitcoin tie on, so I decided to wear my Bitcoin hat to show my street cred and Bitcoin maximalism. Yeah, so just as with Pete, I came to Bitcoin via Wences. I met Wences, I think it was 2013, maybe latest 2014. I think it was 2013 out at Sun Valley at the annual conference that Allen Company has, which brings together people from tech people, Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, government officials, and people from sports and Hollywood. And Wences gave a talk similar to what he said today, but a longer talk explaining Bitcoin. And I was interested enough in it, and he and I hadn't had lunch, and we chatted about this, and I was interested enough in it to sponsor a conference at the Santa Fe Institute, where I was chairman at the time. And as you may or may not know, the Santa Fe Institute is a scientific research organization that is involved in complex systems theory. And so we did a conference that had a similar name to our panel. It was called Money, Past, Present, and Future. And I invited Wences to give a talk at that. And it brought together, SFI, by the way, was founded by a variety of scientists, including 3 Nobel Prize winners, Ken Arrow in economics, and Murray Gell-Mann in physics, and Phil Anderson in physics. But we brought together a group of economists, cryptographers, mathematicians, historians, sociologists, archaeologists, physicists, and then, business people, investors, entrepreneurs, to just look at the history of money and how it evolved, what had happened, and how different disciplines thought of it. And then, and so it was a very synoptic view of things. And it became clear to me at the time that I think we had the same reaction at this group, which is roughly a year after the Sun Valley conference, that I saw at Sun Valley, and I would venture to say it's the same today. So there were probably 350 people at Sun Valley when Wences gave his talk. And I would guess that of that 350 people, if you surveyed them, and these are, very, very prominent, Bill Gates is always there, Warren Buffett, if you surveyed these people today, call it 6-7 years after that talk, and observing what's happened with Bitcoin, I bet you wouldn't find 5% of them that own Bitcoin. And the same thing with the folks at Santa Fe, very, very smart people. I would guess maybe it's 10% of that. So it's extraordinarily early in the adoption cycle with Bitcoin. And when Mike mentioned that he talked to Stan Druckenmiller saying it was a solution in search of a problem, I would, and I have great respect for Stan, obviously, but I think it's fairly clear what the deal is with Bitcoin. I mean, the question is what role does it play? I mean, what is it? What problem does it solve? And going all the way back to the history of money. In fact, the first financial crisis was, in Rome with Tacitus in the first century AD, and that they've been recurring events in economic history all the way up until last year in 2008 and 2009. And the problem it solves is how do you safeguard a portion of your assets from the vagaries of the financial system, and especially a system which is monopolized by governments. And those monopolies have a way of behaving in ways that are in their own personal interest, and not necessarily, as Wences demonstrated, in the interest of the citizens. And so I think that's the problem that Bitcoin solves. It's completely, it's what it is. It's a decentralized, peer-to-peer, permissionless, unhackable, permanent record of various transactions. And it's the only economic unit that I'm aware of that is both infinitely divisible and instantly transportable, where the supply is completely independent of the demand. So no matter what the demand is for Bitcoin, the supply is 21 million. And there's, it's estimated there are 47 million millionaires in the world. And so if each millionaire wanted one Bitcoin, he or she couldn't have it. They'd have to settle for something less. And I think Coinbase has something like what I recall, like 58 million users or something like that. And so there's billions of smartphones out there, all of which can send and transmit Bitcoin. So Friedrich Hayek wrote a monograph called The Denationalization of Money, where he argued that that money being monopolized has a similar problems with whether it be violence being monopolized by governments or education being monopolized, or that there are things that the private sector can do that the governments can't do or won't do. And he argued for basically denationalizing money and having all kinds of money. And I think somebody earlier mentioned that we did have a period before the Civil War where that was the case. But now let me just get to what Pete was talking about a little bit about network effects. So Bitcoin basically is a global computer network. That's what it is, and the computer network is set up to validate transactions and to keep a record of those transactions, and it's paid by generating about 900 Bitcoin a day. And what I found so interesting about this network is that it's following the same adoption cycle that all of the great technological innovations have had. And when I bought the Bitcoin, which I followed Wences's view, and I put 1% of my liquid net worth in it, and I think my average cost was around $300.
Estoy en una conferencia con 3,000 personas.
What's that?
Sorry.
But I was referred to for a long time as a Bitcoin bull, and I'd correct that and say, I'm not a Bitcoin bull, I'm a Bitcoin observer. I'm just observing what it's doing. And what I could afford to lose, anybody can afford to lose 1 or even 2% of their net worth. But there's asymmetric risk reward here. And so I was an observer up until probably a year and a half ago. And then it's finally like, no, this is actually going to work. It's survived a lot of travails, and it's continuing to survive and thrive. And so if you go back and look, just go all the way back, look at the printing press, and then look at the steam engine. And then look at railroads, electricity, autos, computers, the internet. All of them follow a similar path. It's a path that, if you can read a book called The Diffusion of Innovation by Ev Rogers, it's a classic, or maybe make it more up to date. The Stanford economist, reformed Stanford economist Brian Arthur, has 2 books. One of them called Increasing Returns and Path Dependence in the Economy, and the other called The Nature of Technology. And what Brian talks about in that book, and I'll wrap up here to not to monopolize things, but what Brian talks about in those books is that because technology is required to be interoperable, and when it also consists of networks, and the networks become more valuable the more people are on the network, then they follow a certain path. And what happens is that initially there's a burst of innovation. We saw that with Bitcoin being the first, but then Ethereum came along, and then you had other ones, and then you had the forks, and then you had this explosion of ICOs. And those, I think we have 8,500 or something now tokens and ICOs floating out there, most of which I think are worthless or will be worthless. But again, that's a very traditional thing in evolutionary theory, where you had, if you had the Cambrian explosion, where after a great extinction event, all kinds of new life forms sprung up, but then it coalesced down to a smaller number. And in technology, what happens is once you reach what Brian regards as lock-in, so once you reach a dominance of a particular technology that's 50% or greater, then it's very, very difficult. Other technologies can survive, but they can't thrive. And they will never be anything like what those dominant technologies are. And we see that right today. So once we had dominance with Google in search, Google dominates search, Facebook in social, Amazon in retail. So with those kinds of things, you're getting the same thing in Bitcoin. I think Wences had what I thought was one of the more remarkable comments, was Bitcoin dominance right now has come down again in this flurry of activity. But Bitcoin dominance, and correct me if I'm wrong here, in electricity usage is something like, or energy usage is something like 98%. So it's a very, very large number, and it basically indicates kind of game over in that, in that space. So I'll just end by saying what Brian Arthur showed in his work is, as he says, of networks there will be few.